One of the overarching storylines of this second Trump term is the considerable straining of the US's relationship with its allies across the globe. The most visible falling out has been between the US and its NATO and European allies, over things like Trump's tariffs, Greenland threats, and now his war on Iran. However, Trump hasn't just limited his verbal attacks to his transatlantic partners. In recent comments lambasting the US's traditional allies for not helping with the US and Israeli-launched war, he also focused his rhetorical fire on US allies in the Asia-Pacific, specifically naming South Korea, Japan, and Australia. Asia-Pacific allies are in a particularly unenviable position. They're among the most exposed to the war-induced energy shock given the region's reliance on Middle Eastern fossil fuel imports, and their long-established security strategies are centred on their alliances with the US, which is looking like an increasingly unreliable and unpredictable partner. So, in this video, we're going to explain the downturn in the US's relationship with its Asian allies, and what they're doing in response. We're going to start by looking at South Korea, before moving on to Japan. Trump's pressure on the US-South Korea relationship predates his return to office. During his first term, he ruffled feathers with his on-off bromance with North Korea's Kim Jong-un, leaving South Korea somewhat sidelined by his personal diplomacy. Trump also demanded that South Korea nearly quintuple its financial contribution towards the roughly 28,500 US troops stationed in the country, as well as considering scaling back or ending the US military presence in South Korea that dates back to the Korean War in the early 1950s. The cost-sharing dispute was settled under Joe Biden, who got South Korea to agree to a 13.9% increase in its contribution. Trump's second term brought new strain. He slapped South Korea with a 25% tariff on so-called Liberation Day, a big blow to such an export-oriented economy. Then in September, South Koreans were outraged by an aggressive US immigration raid on a Hyundai plant in Georgia that saw over 300 Koreans detained and deported. Since the war in Iran began, relations have only strained further. For Trump, South Korea's reluctance to get involved in reopening the Strait of Hormuz was evidence of it being an ungrateful ally. South Korea, meanwhile, nervously watched as Trump transferred a THAAD anti-ballistic missile system from South Korea to the Middle East, signalling that the US was more concerned with the Middle East than challenges faced in East Asia, namely North Korea and China. The redeployment of the crucial system was particularly frustrating for South Korea, as its initial deployment in 2017 had prompted China to hit South Korea with billions of dollars worth of boycotts and trade restrictions. President Li Qiang publicly opposed the THAAD redeployment, but acknowledged that he could not stop Trump from doing it, a clear demonstration of the imbalance in the two countries' relationship. Even in March 2025, before much of what we've just spoken about, polling showed more than 52% of South Koreans thought the US-South Korea relationship would worsen going forward. But in what is perhaps a sign that they really don't see many other options for their main security partner, a record 85.8% of South Koreans backed the alliance with the US over alignment with China. Nevertheless, there is clearly an appetite for South Korea to boost its military self-reliance. President Lee said this year that, while the US alliance is an essential pillar of peace and stability on the peninsula, excessive dependence is not desirable. And he's pushing for the US to transfer wartime operational control of the South Korean military to South Korea. Perhaps most starkly, polling from last year showed record support in South Korea for developing its own indigenous nuclear capability, at 76.2%. Moving on, Japan has found itself in similarly choppy waters vis-à-vis its relationship with the United States. It, for example, was also left stunned by Trump's tariffs. Japanese officials were frustrated at the Trump administration's relatively muted support for Japan amid a feud that erupted between Japan and China after Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi made comments in support of Taiwan. And then, following the outbreak of the Iran war, Takaichi played a very delicate game trying to explain to Trump why Japan wasn't heeding his call to go into the Middle East and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. For reference, the war is deeply unpopular in Japan, and the country's pacifist constitution places strict limitations on overseas military deployment. Takaichi's attempt to keep Trump on side at their March meeting ended up being overshadowed by Trump's startling use of Pearl Harbor as justification for not warning allies in advance about attacking Iran, a comment that generated unease in Japan. Like with South Korea, the US's focus on Iran has also impacted Japan's security footing. The Japan-based US 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit was sent to the Middle East in March, and Japan's order for hundreds of Tomahawk missiles from the US has reportedly been disrupted due to the US's prioritising of munitions for the Iran war. Again, as in South Korea, there are concerns in Japan about Trump's transactional style of diplomacy, particularly with his upcoming visit to China to meet Xi Jinping, where there is the potential for him to try and strike some kind of deal with China without Korean or Japanese input. After all, while Trump clearly sees China as the US's major economic rival, he does seem somewhat less concerned about it as a strategic and military competitor. This is reflected in Trump's new national security and defense strategies, which reprioritize the Western Hemisphere, downgrades China as a threat, and hardly mentions Taiwan. So, with doubts about the US's commitment to the region's security, Japan, while still maintaining the US alliance, is unsurprisingly expanding its own military capabilities and promoting closer defense cooperation with other non-US partners, from Australia to the Philippines to Canada to Europe. Ultimately, we're not seeing the rupturing of the US's alliances in Asia. Governments like the South Korean and Japanese ones still recognise it as essential. However, they're under significant and increasing strain amid growing doubts about the US's commitment to the region, forcing US allies to recalibrate, boost their own defense capabilities, and diversify cooperation with other partners. This is true of trade and economics too. In the wake of Trump's protectionism, and with the Asia-Pacific bearing the brunt of the war-induced energy crisis, US allies in the region have looked to China. Just this week, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese spoke with Chinese Premier Li Qiang on how best to cooperate on things like energy security. And Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who has otherwise taken an assertive line against China, particularly in regard to maritime disputes, said a few weeks ago that amid the geopolitical chaos, there would certainly have to be a very, very serious restructuring of the Philippines and region's relations with China. As we mentioned earlier, the latest edition of our magazine, Too Long, is out now. And if you subscribe using code TLDR26, then you'll get £4 off your first copy, bringing the price as low as £3.99, our lowest ever price, as well as getting you 20% off every future issue as long as you stay subscribed. Speaking of future editions, let me show you for the very first time this summer's edition of the magazine, currently entitled Trump's Rules of War. This map on the cover shows a dot for each region struck by Trump since returning to office last year, and there's always the chance it'll look even redder before we go to print. Inside this issue, we'll be running through each of these different conflicts, airstrikes, and incursions.
A little excursion to take care of nuclear weaponry?
Sorry, excursions. So if you want to track that timeline with us and better understand what's motivating Trump here, then you'll want a copy of this summer's Too Long, where we'll also be discussing a whole load of other topics. Luckily, if you subscribe today, you'll not only get the spring issue immediately, but you'll also be signed up for this summer too, ensuring this issue lands through your letterbox or in your inbox as soon as possible.